The bullies had no idea that Aisha was a martial arts champion. What would you do if those who tormented you suddenly realized you were much stronger than they ever imagined? Aisha Carter was always quiet, humble, and kept her head down. To the bullies at Westwood High School, she was the perfect target, just a skinny black girl who never fought back, an easy subject for their cruel jokes. Every day, they laughed at her, shoved her to the ground, and humiliated her, believing she couldn't do anything to fight back. But they didn't know Aisha had a secret that would leave them silent and trembling in fear. Aisha Carter slowly walked through the crowded hallways of Westwood High, holding her books tightly to her chest as if they were a shield protecting her from the outside world. She always kept her head down, avoiding the gaze of those who might cause trouble. As a black girl in a predominantly white school, she knew she was always being noticed, but not in a positive way. Every day, going to school felt like walking into a battlefield. She hadn't done anything wrong, but that didn't matter to Emily Parker, one of the most powerful students at school. Aisha was just the perfect target. Emily wasn't just an ordinary bully. She was the daughter of a wealthy family, a star student who always believed she had the right to stand above others. With her perfectly styled blonde hair and smug smile, Emily always had a group of friends trailing behind her, ready to laugh along with whatever joke she made. And for a long time, Aisha had become their favorite target. "Hey, Aisha, where are you off to, looking so busy?" Emily sneered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Probably hiding out in the library like a nerd." One of her friends yelled, causing the crowd around them to burst into laughter. "Are you sure you know how to read? I thought you guys were only good at running around," came Emily's sharp taunt, a racist jab. Aisha paused for a second but kept walking, trying not to react. She had become used to these kinds of insults. If she responded, it would only give them more reason to keep tormenting her. Emily didn't stop with words. Sometimes they'd shove Aisha into the lockers, throw her books on the floor, or even steal her lunch right in front of everyone. No one intervened. Some students were afraid of Emily, others simply didn't care. Aisha knew that if she fought back, things could get worse. But she couldn't run forever, and she knew one day everything would change. Aisha couldn't remember the last time she went to school without feeling anxious. Every morning, as she walked through the school gates, she was always on edge, trying to predict what new torment Emily and her friends would come up with. But no matter how mentally prepared she was, the humiliation always came in ways she couldn't anticipate. Emily wasn't just a typical bully. She was manipulative, skilled at twisting everything to work in her favor. She never directly attacked right away. Instead, she created an atmosphere where Aisha was constantly put down, always seen as inferior, and everyone around her silently accepted that. They didn't just push Aisha around or steal her lunch. They wanted her to feel that her existence in this school was a mistake. They wanted her to feel isolated, to believe that no one was on her side, that she was alone and powerless against them. Aisha clearly remembered a time in the library when she was sitting quietly, reading, trying to forget the mocking stares. Suddenly, Emily and two of her lackeys appeared, strolling over with smirks on their faces. One of them grabbed the book from her hands, pulled out a red marker, and scribbled a racial slur on the cover page. "Let me decorate this for you. You don't really look like you should be holding a book like this. It's like a fish trying to climb a tree," Emily mocked, her friends laughing along. Aisha clenched her fists but said nothing, just lowered her head and picked up the book. She had learned that resisting only gave them more reasons to continue tormenting her. But the silence didn't stop them. It only made them think she would never stand up for herself. In the cafeteria, when Aisha was waiting in line to buy lunch, one of Emily's lackeys snatched a tray from her hands and dumped it on the floor, spilling food everywhere. The whole room erupted in laughter as Aisha bent down to pick it up. Emily stepped over and placed her foot on the bread, pressing down and grinding it like it was nothing. "Look, I just taught you a lesson in economics here. Your stuff isn't worth anything," Emily sneered. Aisha didn't look up, didn't say a word. She just quietly stood up and walked out of the cafeteria, leaving Emily and her gang's laughter trailing behind her. But the worst part wasn't their abuse. The worst part was the silence from everyone around her. The other students, some felt pity, some felt uncomfortable, But no one dared to speak up. Even the teachers, who were supposed to protect her, either ignored it or pretended not to see. Some even seemed to side with Emily, as if they too believed Aisha shouldn't make such a big deal about it, that it was just harmless teasing. Aisha had gotten used to it. She knew if she fought back, things would only get worse. If she reported it, Emily would deny it. People would believe her, and Aisha would be labeled as sensitive, unable to take a joke, or a troublemaker. So she stayed silent. She endured. She told herself that as long as she didn't respond, it would eventually pass. But deep down, Aisha knew that one day she wouldn't be able to stay silent anymore. One day, she wouldn't want to endure it anymore. And when that day came, no one would be able to stop her. Aisha rode her bike down the quiet street, the sunset casting a long shadow of her on the road. She wasn't in a hurry to go home because, to her, home wasn't really the place where she felt safest. After a long day of enduring Emily's contemptuous looks and harsh words, she needed a place to breathe, a place where no one saw her as inferior, a place where she didn't have to pretend everything was fine. She cycled past bustling streets, passing brightly lit shops and crowded cafes, then turned into a narrow alley where an old wooden sign swayed gently in the evening breeze, reading Kobayashi Martial Arts Academy. To outsiders, this dojo was just a forgotten corner of the city. But to Aisha, it was the only place where she could truly be herself. She pushed open the door and took a deep breath. The smell of sweat, old wood, and the familiar mat brought her instant peace. In the quiet space, the sound of soft canvas shoes scraping the floor could be heard as other students practiced, focused on each movement. In the center of the room, Sensei Kobayashi, a Japanese man with a solid build and sharp eyes, stood observing, his hands clasped behind his back. When he saw Aisha enter, he said nothing, just nodded, a small but respectful gesture. Aisha bowed in return and walked to the corner of the room where she always warmed up before training. But before she could start, the deep voice of Sensei Kobayashi echoed, "Is something wrong today?" Aisha paused for a moment, then shook her head, pretending nothing was wrong. She was too used to hiding what she felt. But Sensei Kobayashi was not easily fooled. He walked over, his seasoned eyes seeing through everything Aisha was trying to conceal. "Aisha, you can hide your feelings from the world, but you cannot hide them from yourself." Aisha clenched her fists, feeling her chest surge with something she couldn't put into words. She didn't want to speak out. She didn't want to admit that every day at school was a psychological battle that she always lost. Sensei Kobayashi placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice slow but firm. "People can take your honor, but no one can take the strength inside of you." Those words made Aisha shiver. She had heard them many times before, but today they held a different meaning because she knew that every day, Emily and her friends were trying to take away the strength inside her. They didn't just want her to feel weak. They wanted her to believe that she truly had no strength at all. Aisha clenched her fists, but this time it wasn't out of anger. It was because she didn't want to let them win. Aisha had been practicing martial arts since she was young, back when her father was still alive. Martial arts wasn't just a skill for self-defense. It was part of who she was, a legacy her father had passed down. Her father used to say that martial arts wasn't for fighting but for controlling oneself, and Aisha had always believed in that. She had never used martial arts to fight, even when Emily and her friends bullied her, even when they humiliated her in front of the whole school. She didn't want to use her strength to become like them. But today, for the first time, she started to wonder, was her patience really the right thing to do? As she stepped onto the training floor and began performing the first moves, a quick kick, a solid punch, a sharp defensive maneuver, she felt like she was rediscovering a part of herself that she had lost, a strong part, a part that couldn't be broken. Aisha didn't know what would happen in the days ahead, but one thing she was certain of: things couldn't continue like this forever. And when the time came, she would be ready. The training session ended, and Aisha walked out of the dojo, feeling a bit tired but also relieved. After hours of disciplined practice, she gently pulled her hoodie over her head, a habit she had when she didn't want anyone to notice her. But as she wheeled her bike out of the narrow alley, a familiar voice rang out with a tone full of contempt. How ridiculous. A black girl learning martial arts? Who gave you the idea you could be stronger than us? Aisha froze immediately. Her heart raced as she realized Emily was standing just a few steps away, arms crossed over her chest, a mocking smile on her face. Behind her, her loyal followers, Sarah and Jessica, chimed in, their eyes lighting up as if they'd just discovered a secret they could use to torment her further. Aisha stayed still, but she knew she couldn't show weakness. If she showed even a hint of fear, Emily would never leave her alone. She tightened her backpack strap, took a deep breath, and quietly started to push her bike forward. But Emily wasn't going to let her go that easily. "Hey, I'm talking to you, rat." She stepped forward, blocking Aisha's way. "You think learning martial arts will change anything? You think you'll beat me?" She scoffed, her eyes gleaming with disdain. "Or are you dreaming of becoming like those fighters you watch on TV? Listen, kid, you can learn whatever you want, but you'll never be on our level. Never." Aisha felt a surge of anger rise inside her, but she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't let Emily control her emotions, and that was exactly what she wanted. She turned her head to walk away, but just as she passed by, Emily suddenly slapped her hard on the back, forcing her to stop. "Watch out, Aisha. You know, sometimes accidents happen. Someone might accidentally ruin your dojo." "Who knows?" she whispered, her voice smooth but laced with a hidden threat. Aisha stood still, her body tense. Emily wasn't just mocking her anymore. She was targeting her dojo, the one place where Aisha truly felt safe. Aisha knew that Emily and her group weren't just making empty threats. If they really wanted to cause trouble, they could make things much worse. A memory suddenly flooded her mind. A night many years ago when Aisha was still a child, standing in the dojo with her father, listening to him talk about the tough training days. Her father had said, "You may lose many things in life, but you must never let anyone take away your fighting spirit." But right now, Aisha's fighting spirit was being tested more than ever. She clenched her fist, but instead of confronting Emily, she simply stared at her, unwavering, unafraid. Then she walked away without saying a word, leaving Emily and her friend standing there, still laughing mockingly, as if they had won. From that day on, things only got worse. If Emily had merely insulted her before, now she was deliberately taking things further. Her group started drawing racist symbols on Aisha's locker, leaving papers with offensive words on her desk. One time, in gym class, Sarah pretended to accidentally shove Aisha to the floor, then laughed loudly with her friends. "Whoa, look at that. Our little fighter just fell on the ground. Guess you haven't learned that move yet, huh, Aisha?" Everyone around them laughed, but Aisha just gritted her teeth, quietly standing up without saying anything. At lunch, when she placed her tray on the table, Emily walked by and knocked the tray to the floor as if it were an accident. "Oh, I'm so clumsy. Hope you don't mind picking that up." She shrugged, smiling casually. Aisha didn't reply, just bent down to pick up the food scattered on the floor, ignoring the crowd's mocking laughter. But inside, her anger was growing like a storm. But the worst part hadn't happened yet. One late afternoon, when Aisha arrived at the dojo as usual, she saw something that made her heart stop. The outside wall of the dojo was covered with racist words and crude, offensive drawings. She froze, a cold shiver running down her spine. Master Kobayashi was kneeling on the floor, holding a cloth, calmly wiping away the stains on the wall. But his eyes remained as calm as ever. When he saw Aisha, he simply looked at her and said softly, "We'll clean this up, Aisha. The worst things never stay for long." But Aisha couldn't be as calm as him. She knew exactly who had done this. She knew Emily was trying to provoke her, trying to destroy the one place she truly cherished. Aisha gritted her teeth, clenched her fists. For the first time in her life, she felt that her patience was breaking down. If they wanted a reaction, maybe this time they would get something they didn't expect. Everything felt like an endless loop. The bullying became bolder, the insults more venomous, but Aisha remained silent, holding it in, constantly reminding herself that martial arts were not for revenge, but for self-control. But everyone has a limit, and tonight, that limit was broken. Aisha left the library after the sun had set behind the tall buildings, leaving the sky in a deep purple hue. She didn't realize she was being followed. As she stepped into the parking lot behind the school, a shadow darted out from the side, blocking her way. Emily. She stood there, hands in her pockets, the dim streetlights reflecting off her face, highlighting her smug half-smile. Behind her, Sarah and Jessica, two loyal henchmen, stood with arms crossed, their eyes filled with defiance. Aisha immediately understood what was happening. They weren't here just to talk. You thought I didn't know, huh? Emily slowly stepped forward, her voice dragging on as if savoring the moment. You think I don't know what you're doing, Aisha? You're trying to change something. You think just because you know a few moves, you can fight us off? Aisha didn't respond, standing still with her hands clenched around the straps of her backpack. She was too familiar with Emily's tactics. She never attacked immediately. She wanted to break you with words first before finishing you off with fists. Looks like you still haven't learned your lesson, so let me teach you again. Before Aisha could react, Sarah lunged at her from behind. Aisha felt a sharp tug on her shoulder, then a cold streak of paint swiped across her back. Aisha jerked back, but was too late. When she turned around, her white shirt was smeared with a red racist symbol scrawled with malicious intent. Emily's laugh echoed, blending with the cold wind in the empty parking lot. You look more like one of them now. Jessica laughed loudly, slapping Sarah on the back as if she had just done something great. Aisha stood motionless, her mind blank for a moment. But soon, the rage she had suppressed for years erupted like a storm. But they weren't finished. Emily, still wearing that sneering grin, took another step forward. She bent down, snatched the book from Aisha's hands, and threw it to the ground. Clunk. Aisha froze. It wasn't just a book. It was her father's old notebook, where he had written down martial arts lessons and philosophies he always wanted Aisha to remember. And now it lay on the ground, the cover crushed under Emily's boot. You don't belong here. Her voice dropped lower, colder, more venomous than ever. This is not your world. The world around Aisha seemed to stand still. All the images in her mind, the childhood days with her father, the training at the dojo, the time she had endured under Emily's taunts, everything faded away, leaving only a fiery rage burning in her chest. For the first time in her life, Aisha felt she couldn't take it anymore. For the first time in her life, she wanted to fight back. She clenched her fists, her breath quickening, her legs instinctively shifting into a fighting stance. Sarah and Jessica began to sense something was wrong. They paused and exchanged glances, but Emily still didn't realize. She was still relishing her victorious moment, until Aisha slowly lifted her head, and her gaze made all three of them freeze. No more fear, no more weakness, only the deadly silence of a storm before it sweeps everything in its path. The atmosphere in the parking lot grew dense, so heavy that even the wind seemed to come to a standstill. Aisha stood there, fists clenched so tightly they turned white, each breath slow and deep, as if she were trying to hold back an impending tsunami about to break loose. Her gaze fixed on Emily, no longer filled with fear, no longer submissive, no longer the shy girl who had bowed her head and endured for all these years. Emily furrowed her brows, seemingly surprised by the sudden change in Aisha, but she couldn't let her subordinate see her falter. She took a step forward provocatively, like a wolf closing in on its prey. Look who's found some courage, she sneered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. You think you can take us on just because you know a few stupid moves? Let me teach you one last lesson. She grabbed Aisha by the collar, but this time, things didn't go the way Emily had expected. Aisha reacted immediately, a quick, precise movement, nearly invisible in the darkness. She grabbed Emily's wrist, spun around, and used the arm lock technique that Master Kobayashi had taught her to break free from Emily's grip. In just 1 second, Aisha was free, stepping back with her feet firmly planted on the ground, her posture ready. The entire parking lot fell silent. Emily hesitated, her eyes flashing with momentary confusion. She hadn't expected Aisha to move that quickly, nor had she expected her to break free from her hold with such a simple maneuver. Sarah and Jessica chuckled, but it wasn't the usual carefree laughter. It was awkward, uncertain. What the hell? Jessica muttered, her gaze on Aisha, bewildered. Emily, furious at her own confusion, gritted her teeth, and charged forward again, this time with all the brutality she could muster. But what she didn't know was that the girl she had once seen as a weak victim was no longer there. Aisha no longer avoided, no longer ran away. As Emily lunged, Aisha shifted her foot slightly to the side, turning in the direction of Emily's movement, using her opponent's own force to unbalance her. Thud! Emily stumbled, losing her footing, almost falling flat on her face. Aisha hadn't thrown a single punch. She had simply used defensive techniques, but it was enough to silence Emily's group. Sarah and Jessica began to realize that this was no longer just a game. Aisha stood there, calm, her stance solid like a true fighter. Emily was fuming. She had never been so humiliated in front of her followers. "You think you're so tough," she growled, his eyes flashing with hatred. This time, she didn't charge recklessly. She gritted her teeth, clenched her fists, and genuinely prepared for a strong punch. Aisha saw it all. She didn't need to read Emily's mind to know what she would do next. She had seen that stance hundreds of times in the dojo. Emily would aim for her face, trying to end it with a straight punch, using brute strength instead of technique. But Aisha wasn't afraid. She was ready. Emily struck. Aisha dodged to the side, fast as lightning. Emily couldn't react in time. Her arm swiped through the air, missing entirely. Aisha seized the opportunity, using a simple yet effective sweeping leg move to unbalance Emily. Thud! Emily fell to the ground. Sarah and Jessica were stunned. Both stood frozen, not daring to move. Emily was completely dazed. She looked up at Aisha, her eyes filled with disbelief. But there was something she didn't want to admit: fear. For the first time in her life, Emily realized she had made a huge mistake. Aisha was no longer the shy girl she once was. Aisha bent down, picked up her old notebook from her father, brushed the dust off the cover, then looked directly at Emily, her gaze sharp but devoid of hatred. "I don't want to fight, but I'm not scared of you anymore." Aisha turned and walked away, leaving behind a defeated Emily, filled with fear, experiencing for the first time the feeling of being the weak one. The parking lot was engulfed in silence, a suffocating quiet so heavy that even the smallest sounds, the wind rustling through the leaves, the crunch of footsteps on the pavement, the ragged breaths of those who had just failed, became unervingly clear. Gone were the mocking laughs, the derogatory words, the arrogant self-satisfaction of those who always considered themselves the strong ones. Only the stifling atmosphere of shock remained as three people who once ruled the school now lay sprawled on the ground, completely defeated by someone they had once thought would always bow to them. Emily, who had always been at the top of the food chain in her small world, who had never tasted failure, now lay crumpled on the cold pavement, her filthy hands pushing down into the ground in a futile attempt to rise. The pain wasn't just from the fall, but from the humiliation igniting inside her, a humiliation like never before. As for the first time, she felt weak, small, in front of someone she had always despised. She clenched herself, trying to regain some shred of dignity. But when she looked up, there was no longer the arrogance of a winner in her gaze, only confusion mixed with something she refused to admit: fear. Aisha stood there unmoving, no punches thrown, no threats made, simply controlling every movement, every breath, every glance, as if the entire fight hadn't even touched her. She didn't need to appear strong, didn't need to show off her power or throw insults like Emily had done for years, because in that very moment, she had won in a way Emily could never understand. Sarah, who had always followed Emily like a loyal hound, stood frozen, his eyes flicking with unease as he witnessed a scene he never could have anticipated. He had just watched the person he always considered the weakest in school take down the whole group without using any violence, just through terrifying calmness and flawless technique. Every move Aisha made, every step, every counterattack, was so fast it seemed like she had practiced it thousands of times for this moment. And that made Sarah shiver. Jessica, another of Emily's lackeys, stood a few feet away, her hands clenched together, her body stiff as if she were battling with herself, deciding whether to charge in or not. But when her eyes met Aisha's, who stood there unfazed, calm, not a trace of panic or hatred, he hesitated. Part of him wanted to charge, wanted to try again, wanted to prove that everything that had just happened was a mistake. But another part of him, a part he didn't want to admit, knew he couldn't change anything. Emily gasped, her hands trembling as they pushed against the ground, trying to get up, but her knees shook from the fall. She stared at Aisha, her mouth open as if to say something but unable to form words. For a moment, his eyes betrayed anger, hatred, and frustration as he realized he couldn't do anything against the girl he had once considered weak. But deep inside, beneath the mask of wounded pride, was fear creeping into her mind, a fear she had never experienced before. Aisha didn't say a word, didn't need to. She simply bent down, picked up her father's old notebook, dusted off the cover, then casually slung her backpack over her shoulder as if everything that had just happened was a trivial matter, not worth worrying about. She didn't need to retaliate, didn't need to prove anything, because she had come to a simple truth. Emily no longer had any power over her. When Aisha turned and walked away, no one dared to stop her. No one dared to say a word. Even Emily, her pride shattered, couldn't bring herself to speak. And then she left, leaving behind a heavy silence, one that Emily and her crew had never known, a silence that was no longer a sign of fear, but a sign of a new era, one where Aisha was no longer the victim, but the one in control. The next morning, as Aisha walked into school, she immediately sensed something was off. Eyes were on her. Whispers filled the air behind her, and there were sneaky glances mixed with curiosity, astonishment, and even doubt. No one said anything directly to her, but she didn't need them to. She knew that news of the confrontation last night had spread through the school like wildfire. The hallways, hidden corners, the cafeteria tables, groups of friends huddling together. Everyone was talking about something no one could have imagined before. Aisha Carter, the girl everyone thought was weak, had beaten Emily Parker. But what made Aisha uncomfortable was how the story was being told. She had known Emily wouldn't take defeat easily, but she never expected her to twist the truth so blatantly. From what she overheard in the whispers around her, the story had been completely distorted. According to Emily's version, Aisha had ambushed her and her friends in the parking lot, attacking them without reason, using dirty tricks to take her down when she wasn't prepared. In her version, Aisha wasn't the one attacked but the attacker. I didn't expect her to be so aggressive. I was just walking by, and she came at me like a wild animal. Emily pretended to tell a group of students in the hallway, her voice full of hurt but also barely concealing her bitterness. She ambushed us. I didn't even have a chance to react. You know I'm not one for fighting, but she didn't give me a choice. See, my arm still hurts. She raised her arm, though there were no visible wounds, but it made a few people around her nod sympathetically. Emily wasn't just telling a story. She was trying to make herself the victim, to make everyone believe Aisha was the aggressor, a dangerous student, someone who couldn't control her anger. Aisha heard all of this, but she didn't speak. She just walked down the narrow hallways, feeling the eyes following her, sensing how the atmosphere around her had shifted. She could see the hesitation on the faces of other students. Some seemed to support her, but many were still skeptical because, no matter how much they hated Emily, they had never seen Aisha actually stand up for herself before. She had always been the quiet one, the one who endured, the one who never responded. So what if Aisha did attack first? What if everything Emily said was true? And that's exactly what Emily wanted. She couldn't change the fact that she had lost, but she could turn her defeat into a victory in terms of reputation. If she couldn't beat Aisha with her fists, she would beat her with lies, manipulating people's thoughts, sowing doubt in those who didn't fully understand what had really happened. And that made Aisha more anxious than anything else. She wasn't afraid of Emily. She wasn't afraid of the lies. But she feared the silence of those who knew the truth, but didn't dare speak up. The entire day passed with an underlying tension that everyone could feel. When Aisha walked into the cafeteria at lunch, she could clearly hear the murmurs as she passed by. Students who had never paid attention to her before now looked at her with a strange, cautious curiosity. But what troubled Aisha the most wasn't the gossip from strangers. It was the looks from those she thought were friends. Trey, one of the few black students in the school who Aisha used to chat with occasionally in class, just glanced at her for a moment before turning away, as though he didn't want to be involved. Lena, a girl who had always been kind to her, seemed like she wanted to approach him, but when she saw others watching, She hesitated and quietly turned away. Aisha couldn't blame them. Everyone had something they wanted to protect. She sat down at an empty table, quietly opening her lunchbox, but she knew no one was really going to leave her alone. On the other side of the cafeteria, Emily was still telling her version of events, pulling more people to her side, continuing to control the narrative in the way she wanted. And then, just as Aisha had predicted, things didn't stop there. At the end of the school day, when she was about to leave, a message from the principal's office popped up on her phone. "Aisha Carter, please report to the principal's office immediately." Aisha stared at the screen, her palms starting to sweat. She didn't need to guess what was waiting for her. Emily had gone one step further. She didn't just want to manipulate the story in the eyes of the students. She wanted to make it the truth in the eyes of the school. Aisha stood in front of the principal's office, her hands tightly gripping the straps of her backpack, while her mind was blank. She knew exactly what awaited her inside. This wasn't the first time she had to face injustice, but perhaps this was the first time she felt completely alone. She took a deep breath and gently pushed the door open. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, like a trial that had already been decided. Principal Parker, a middle-aged man with graying hair and metal-rimmed glasses, was sitting behind his desk, his face stern as if he had already made a decision in his mind. Next to him was the school counselor, Mrs. Bennett, whom Aisha had once hoped would be fair, but from the look in her eyes, she could tell she had already been swayed by Emily's story before she even had a chance to speak. As for Emily, she sat firmly in the chair across from the principal's desk, one arm crossed over her chest, the other holding a bandage on her arm as if she had just endured a heavy beating. She played the victim perfectly, her expression full of hurt, as if she were the true victim in this entire story. "I'm very disappointed, Aisha." Principal Parker's voice was low, his gaze filled with reproach. "I didn't think you were the troublemaker type, but what I've heard is something I can't ignore." Aisha remained silent, knowing that anything she said at this moment could be twisted. She had to wait, to listen to how they would try to paint a false story about her. "She ambushed us in the parking lot, sir." Emily spoke up, her voice trembling slightly, but not from fear. Rather, it was because she was using every bit of fake emotion to make the story sound more believable. "I don't know why Aisha acted like that. Maybe I accidentally made her angry before, but I never thought she would attack me like that. I had no choice but to defend myself, but I couldn't fight back." She paused for a moment, then lowered her head as if recalling a terrifying moment. "I just hope Aisha understands that violence is never the solution." A long silence followed. Aisha gritted her teeth, feeling the anger rising inside her. Violence is never the solution. It was Emily who had pushed Aisha to her limits. It was Emily who had threatened her, stomped on her books, and written racist slurs on her shirt. And now she dared to play the victim? Mrs. Bennett turned to Aisha, her eyes gentle, but clearly filled with doubt. "Aisha, would you like to explain what happened?" Aisha opened her mouth to speak, but just then, the principal's office door suddenly swung open. Everyone turned to look. Sarah walked in, Sarah Dawson, one of the white students in the class who had always kept silent about everything, who had never intervened in Emily's bullying, who had never said a word when Aisha was humiliated in the schoolyard. But today she spoke up. She stood tall, her gaze steady as she looked directly at the principal without hesitation, without fear. "I'm sorry for interrupting, but I need to say this." Her voice was calm but firm. "I saw everything." The room suddenly became as silent as a tomb. Principal Parker frowned, clasping his hands together. "Everything? What do you mean?" Sarah took a deep breath, and then turned to look directly at Emily without fear. "I saw everything that happened in the parking lot last night. It was Emily and her group who blocked Aisha's path. They provoked her, pushed her to her limit, and they attacked first." She paused for a moment, then continued, her voice firm. "Aisha was only defending herself. She didn't attack anyone. All she did was protect herself." A wave of shock swept through the room. Emily suddenly turned pale. She spun around, her eyes flashing with panic for a brief moment before she tried to regain her composure. "She's lying. She wasn't there," she snapped. But something in her reaction revealed her panic. Sarah didn't back down. You can check the surveillance cameras in the parking lot." Emily fell silent. All eyes in the room were now on her. Principal Parker, who had maintained a stern demeanor from the beginning, was now staring at Emily with a thoughtful look. Mrs. Bennet also looked at her, but this time there was no trust in her eyes like before. A long silence followed. Emily bit her lip, trying to find a way to turn things around, but she knew it was no longer in her control. Finally, Principal Parker sighed. "Aisha, you can go." Aisha looked up, his eyes full of surprise. "But I said you can go." The principal's voice was still stern, but no longer filled with the accusation it had earlier. Aisha nodded faintly, slinging her backpack over his shoulder and walking out of the room, his heart filled with mixed emotions. She didn't know how to feel. Happy that she was finally exonerated, or confused because she never expected anyone to stand up for her. But one thing she was sure of. For the first time in her life, she was no longer alone. When Aisha walked out of the principal's office, she felt the air around her had changed, even if just a little. The oppressive feeling was gone. No longer did she feel as if she were being judged by invisible eyes. For the first time in many years, she walked without feeling like an outcast in her own school. But the biggest change was not in her, it was in Emily. From the moment Sarah exposed her lies, Emily lost the invisible power she once held. No more admiring looks from her followers, no more loud laughter when she mocked someone, no more self-satisfied chatter when she strutted through the halls as if she owned the place. Now, every time she passed by, eyes averted, voices silenced. Those who once laughed with her now remained quiet, too afraid to meet her gaze. She was no longer the strongest. Sarah and Jessica, two who had once been absolutely loyal to her, now began to keep their distance. They no longer sat with her at the cafeteria, no longer surrounded her during breaks, no longer followed her arrogant words as they once did. They said nothing, but their silence spoke volumes. They were scared, not because of Aisha, but because Emily had shown she was not invincible. And when a ruler loses their crown, those who followed will quickly turn away. No one wants to be associated with a failure. Emily, though always exuding confidence, could no longer hide the change in her eyes. The arrogance was gone. The self-satisfaction had disappeared. Now she walked through the hallways, as if trying to avoid the very looks she once craved. But what stung her the most was not the avoidance of others, but the change happening right